The magic in Dragon's Dogma has always been a massive staple of the franchise. Even for a game that's 12 years old, Dragon's Dogma 1 still has some of the most impactful magic you'll ever see in an action RPG, and it seems like that has been translated over to Dragon's Dogma 2 as well. So with that being said, we're going to go over the two magic vocations that we've seen in Dragon's Dogma 2 so far, the basic vocation Mage and the advanced vocation Sorcerer. And while the terms basic and advanced vocation may imply that Mage is simply a downgrade of Sorcerer, we'll find that that is not exactly the case, and that Mage does play a vital role of its own as a support and defensive spellcaster in comparison to the more offensively oriented Sorcerer. Let's start with the Mage vocation. Its light attack is the magic bolt that we all know and love from Dragon's Dogma 1, and its heavy attack is actually a skill from Dragon's Dogma 1 called Anodyne, which will heal any allies within a target area. So again, instead of taking up a skill slot, this is now bound to the heavy attack. Its vocation action is shared with the Sorcerer vocation, which is called Quick Spell, which will greatly hasten your incantation speed when it's held at the cost of extra stamina. So if you need to get a spell out quickly and you have the stamina to spare, then this vocation action is definitely going to be a nice boost for you. Additionally, mages also gain the ability to levitate, which has been pointed out by myself along with many other Dragon's Dogma 2 fans. As shown recently in the Dragon's Dogma 2 Mage trailer, we will be able to start incanting spells even while we are levitating, which is a change from Dragon's Dogma 1. So those are all the core skills that we have footage for, so let's go over to the skills or the spells that the mage will be slinging in battle. The first and most recognizable skill that many players will come across is Flagration, and this allows the caster to summon a swirling jet of flames that will be propelled straight in front of the user. This flame can pass through multiple targets and also burn them for massive damage. So that's a useful skill for the fire element. Now let's go over to Levin, which is a useful skill for the lightning element. The Levin spell allows you to strike an enemy from above with many tongues of lightning, and you can also summon additional lightning if you have the stamina to account for it. And finally, for the ice element, we have Frigger, which conjures a giant pillar of ice, which can knock back foes, and whenever the initial burst is finished, an additional ice pillar will be left behind for you to use as a platform. And while we have seen footage of the Warfare vocation use it to propel a giant swipe from a great sword after casting Frigger, these can also be used by your pawns to give them an extra boost when they are trying to climb on giant monsters. In addition to all these elemental attacks, similarly the mage gains different boon spells which can be applied to different weapons to give them the different elemental types corresponding to each boon. For example, with Fire boon, the mage can then grant a weapon to have fire attributes. With the Lightning boon, it can grant that same weapon to have lightning attributes. And of course with Ice boon, it can do the same thing for the ice element. As a change from Dragon's Dogma 1, now instead of having a traveling orb of boon that will then travel to whichever weapon you want to enchant, it now seems that this enchanting effect is instantaneous. Of course, while you could buff your mini pawns with different specific elements, you can also buff them with many defensive magics as well, one of which being Palladium. This will allow the caster to summon a defensive orb which will hover over either yourself or any additional ally you want to target with this, and it will block up to 3 hits with that conjured orb as seen here. The advanced variant or high Palladium can also be used to grant orbs to everyone in the party. Similar to conjuring this defensive orb of light, you can also use Empyrean to conjure an offensive orb of light that will deal immediate damage to nearby targets in all directions while also illuminating the space around you. This spell is especially useful at night whenever visibility is limited, and because of its holy attribute will most likely be useful to undead and many different enemies of that type. And lastly, for the Mage Vocation skills, we have Celerity, which conjures a magical sigil, which will then increase the speed of any allies within range. So if you need to get somewhere in a hurry, this might be a useful skill that you can use in a pinch. So as we've mentioned here, the mage has many different abilities that it can use to provide both offensive and defensive capabilities that you can use to gain the upper hand in pretty much any encounter.
Now on to augments. We
we have Exaltation, which is completely new to Dragon's Dogma. This was not available in Dragon's Dogma 1. Being able to unlock this early on as a mage will definitely be very helpful in any playthrough. Apotropeism is literally the same exact skill from Dragon's Dogma 1. Now there might be a bit of difference as to how much magic defense it augments, but this is still pretty much the same skill. Beatitude is the name of another augment that is in Dragon's Dogma 1, however the effect more closely is resembling efficacy from the Ranger vocation. It seems Beatitude on the Mage skill in Dragon's Dogma 2 is going to increase the efficacy for the entire team of any curatives or healing spells you cast for the team. If I'm being 100% honest, the wording of Beatitude in Dragon's Dogma 2 does not directly state whether or not it only applies to yourself or also to your team whenever you cast the curative magics, but it's worth noting that this seems to be sort of a copy of efficacy from the Ranger class, and it might be slightly different here in Dragon's Dogma 2. Intervention is another mage skill from Dragon's Dogma 1 that is slightly different. It looks like the duration of debilitations that you do receive are reduced, whereas in Dragon's Dogma 1, intervention was used to reduce the chance of getting debilitations. So slight change here. It doesn't appear to prevent any sort of chance that you'll get debilitations, only to reduce their effect once you do get them. Furthermore, this seems to only be applied to the mage themselves and not to any of their teammates. And lastly, we have Perpetuation, which is almost directly ripped from Dragon's Dogma 1. In this case, Perpetuation in Dragon's Dogma 1 only applied to weapon enchantments like the boons that we saw earlier, but it seems that Perpetuation in Dragon's Dogma 2 will not only apply to those, but also invigorations that you give to other characters, such as any buffs or increased health, that sort of thing. As the designated support class from Dragon's Dogma 1, it's almost certain that Mage will also be one of the main staples you'll want to keep on your team at all times. Between setting enemies on fire, giving your own sword the ability to conjure fire, or also providing a healing boon, the Mage certainly has a wide range of abilities that you can use to your benefit. Now that we've gone over the Mage vocation sufficiently, let's go over the Sorcerer vocation, which we will see is a much more offensive variant of the Spellcaster archetype. Starting with the core skills of the Sorcerer vocation, we can see that it carries over Magic Bolt from the Mage vocation, but instead of Anodyne, its heavy attack is now Galvanize. This is a core skill that when held will allow the sorcerer to recover stamina through single-minded focus and is a very sharp recovery rate at that. When used well, the sorcerer will almost always have stamina available to use for its many spell casting abilities, which will also be useful for the next core skill, which is the same as the mage, the vocation action quick spell, which will of course hasten incantation speed. Additionally, with the mage vocation, the sorcerer can also levitate as well. And now that we've quickly gone over the core skills, let's get into the main skills, which of course are going to be the most important part of the sorcerer vocation. The sorcerer vocation is confirmed to have many of the offensive skills from mage, such as flagration, leaven, and frigger. But as of course this is a more offensive vocation, it does lose many of the support and defensive capabilities that the mage vocation has. Instead, we have additional attacks such as Salamander, Thundermine, and Hagel. Salamander is a fire elemental attack that will conjure a flame that slithers forth across the ground. It seems to be similar to the Combustion skill from Dragon's Dogma 1, instead traveling in a vertical line instead of a horizontal one. It still conjures a wall of fire that will burn any targets that pass through it. Next we have Thundermine, which was a lightning orb skill that we've seen from previous gameplay. It will conjure a ball of lightning that will automatically unleash crackling bolts at anyone who draws near, knocking down smaller targets. The lightning orb has a set number of attacks before it will dissipate. This of course can be used to defend a single area as well as provide support for any ongoing fight in the vicinity. And lastly we have Hagel, which summons a blizzard in the immediate vicinity that will damage any target it touches. Moving on from the basic elemental attacks, Sorcerer also gains a new one called Decanter, which will sap a target's health and grant it to you. So of course, as you can imagine, this would be great for a vampire roleplay, except you can do it at a distance, it appears. But of course, a sorcerer skill breakdown would be incomplete without mentioning the two elephants in the room, which would be Bolide and Maelstrom. With the use of Bolide, you can summon many different meteors, which will then teleport to the atmosphere and rain down upon your opponents. This is a heavily damaging skill, which will require a long cast time, but the payout is immense. Additionally, this attack covers a wide area, which means that even if you are targeting a single enemy, it may hit nearby enemies as well. Overall, a fantastic skill for you to use in large groups or against tougher bosses. And lastly, of course, is Maelstrom, which can be used to summon a giant tornado to then continuously damage any opponent you summon it to. Again, the spell requires a massive casting time, but once done, your sorcerer will then wave his archistaff in the air and then summon the tornado. This was one of the most effective skills in Dragon's Dogma 1, and of course seems to be the case as well in Dragon's Dogma 2. So as we've seen from the skills, the Sorcerer Vocation is definitely the more offensive of the two, and this is compounded further whenever you look at a concept known as spell syncing. Spell syncing is shown off in Dragon's Dogma 2 whenever fighting against this Dullahan, and it is the ability for multiple sorcerers to join in casting a spell. In this example, a sorcerer pawn that is incantating Bolide is then joined by the Arisen mid-cast to then double its power. So you can imagine if you have a party of 4 and all 4 are sorcerers, there is a potential here for Bolide to then be joined in by the other sorcerers to then increase in power by 4. This of course can be used with many other skills with the Sorcerer Vocation and is definitely a big boost if you're looking for additional offensive capabilities. In addition, in terms of player stats, it does appear that the sorcerer will focus more heavily on the magic stat, which will more govern your offensive capabilities as a spellcaster, as opposed to something like health or magic defense, which is more in line with the mage. This of course makes sorcerer the more potent of the two vocations when it comes to offensive capabilities, but of course, as with everything, there are trade-offs, and you will be left a bit lacking in the defensive capability department. Next, let's go over the different sorcerer augments. The first that we start with is Sagacity, which is actually a straight rip of attunement from the Mage Vocation from Dragon's Dogma 1, which increases your flat magic. Not much else to say, you just get stronger with this. Next up is the Asperity Augment, which is a pretty close copy of Magnitude. Instead of gaining more powerful debilitations, you will now be able to afflict debilitations more often, which is obviously a very nice crowd control tool. Next is Constancy, which augments your knockdown resistance, which is very similar to the Gravitas augment from Dragon's Dogma 1 that was also on the Sorcerer Vocation. So being able to resist being knocked down and not interrupted in your spell casting could be very helpful as well. So overall, it's a pretty strong augment. Next is Stasis, which is more of a utility augment, which reduces the rate at which items deteriorate. Really what this will be helpful with is preventing food from spoiling, as that was a mechanic in Dragon's Dogma 1. Now you could keep perishable items in an airtight flask to then keep them at whatever state you wanted them to be. They would then be in a kept state, but we're not really sure to what extent that will play in Dragon's Dogma 2. And while it is a good utility augment, obviously it's not a combat-oriented augment, so I could see this augment being slotted out for something more effective in direct combat, as that's pretty much what is the draw for Dragon's Dogma 2 and not necessarily inventory management. And finally, the last augment is a new one called Catalysis, which increases damage dealt when exploiting a hostile target's elemental weakness. This is very similar to the lethality augment from the Archer Vocation and is very good if you know what you're doing in Dragon's Dogma. That will only increase in power over time as you gain more knowledge about different enemy types. This is pretty self-explanatory. If a harpy is weak to lightning, if you strike it with lightning, the lightning will deal more damage. If you're fighting someone who I guess is made of ice and you cast fire at it, maybe it'll deal more damage that way too. Things like that, I'm pretty sure, are going to be affected by Catalysis. And that, my friends, will conclude this look at the Mage and Sorcerer Vocations. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully this allows you to gain a bit more knowledge on the different magic vocations as we get closer to the Dragon's Dogma 2 release. And with that, I will end the video. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you again real soon.